Hi, and welcome to Energy Transition Talk, the podcast that explores the challenges and opportunities of transitioning to a low carbon future. I'm Paulina.
I'm Justine.
And I'm Jim.
And we're your hosts for Energy Transition Talk.
In this podcast, we seek to break down some of the most complex and important issues regarding the energy transition and how it impacts us. In each episode, we tell a story by bringing you various perspectives about the energy transition so that you can make the best and most informed decisions for you and your communities.
In 2022, global greenhouse emissions reached a high of 53 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalent. To get that down to net zero by 2050, we can either stop emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, or we can pull out CO2 that's already been emitted. Today, we're going to focus on the latter solution, addressing the areas of our economy where energy emissions are hard to abate.
One innovative solution is carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS, which involves capturing carbon dioxide from the air and storing it underground. In this episode, we first speak with Dr. Saro Meguerdijian, a researcher at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, on CCS, which is now considered a crucial part of addressing our growing carbon emissions. He explains for us what carbon capture and storage is and how it works, as well as the potential role it will play in the energy transition.
Another solution is monitoring carbon emissions for gases like methane to identify and mitigate leaks and flares before they become too large. We also speak to two graduate students, Will Daniels from the Colorado School of Mines and Rachel Day from the Colorado State University, whose research focuses on methods for detecting methane emissions from oil and gas production using a cool technique called MMRV, or Monitor, Measure, Report, and Verify.
Technology advances in both areas are developing fast. So these are areas that we need to pay attention to. So let's start off. Here's our conversation with Dr. Meguerdijian on carbon capture and storage. Well, this episode, we're going to focus on kind of renewable energy sources, or maybe other ways that we can manage the carbon from our fossil fuel energies. But we don't want to talk about wind and solar. Everybody kind of talks about wind and solar. So we're going to talk about some other things such as geothermal and hydrogen. But for this interview, we're very fortunate to have Saro Meguerdijian, who is really going to talk to us about a really important topic about carbon sequestration that the industry is really focused on. But it's a really important challenge. If the industry has learned how to take hydrocarbons out of the ground, now we need to learn how to put carbon back into the ground. So, Saro, welcome to the Energy Transition Talk podcast.
Thank you, Jim. Pleasure to be here.
Well, we're going to start out just generally. I mean, would you like to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about what got you into your interest in energy systems, why you came to USC, and then the question we ask everybody, because it's the theme of the podcast, is what does energy transition mean to you?
All right. So I came to USC initially as an undergrad. I was looking at chemical engineering, and I was majoring in chemical engineering. And then towards the end of my freshman year, I decided to pursue petroleum. I realized that was a realistic and valuable option, and also complementary to chemical engineering. So at USC, there is this nice hybrid nature in the undergrad, where you can major in a more general engineering major like chemical engineering or mechanical engineering and develop an emphasis in petroleum engineering. So I did that. After that, I pursued my master's in petroleum engineering at USC, and then went for my PhD. I saw so I've been in the energy systems space a while. I've worked in refining. I did some internships there. I've worked in upstream research, another internship there. I was a fellow at two national laboratories focusing on energy-related work in the subsurface at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And then later on, I actually was a fellow at and worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory. Although, to be clear, everything I'm saying here are solely my own views. They don't represent those of the lab or anyone. So one of the attractive things about the energy field is that it is broad, it is essential, it is in many ways diverse, both in terms of its participation who participates in it, which is pretty much everybody, as well as its impact. One of the things about it, though, is that it's also something that is kind of taken for granted. People don't think much when the lights are on. They do think very much if it doesn't work. So there is this kind of bias towards noticing when things aren't working, even though in the general scheme of things, it's actually very it delivers tremendous value. I mean, we're not using horses to go around. We can drive to the beach. At least in LA, we can drive to the beach. We can drive around. So there is this tremendous freedom that we get from energy, and that I think is a valuable contribution that the kind of work that I do and others in this field do is good for humanity. Now, as far as what does the energy transition mean to me, so it's been about a year since I graduated with my PhD. During that time, I had worked for the United States Department of Energy at Los Alamos National Laboratory looking at geologic carbon storage risk assessment. So I've had experience within academia, and now within industry. I work at an AI company that does work in the energy industry. And what I've seen from the energy transition is that in the scientific community, I think the definition is pretty clear. The definition is movement towards an energy system with lower CO2 emissions, generally lower greenhouse gas emissions, while also providing reliable energy for people in the world and bringing in people who currently do not have access to energy into the energy system. So there are people who are energy poor, don't have access to electricity, so we want to bring them in too. So there is a theme of essentially sustainability, reliability, and you could say, in a sense, some people might call it equity, but I think you could also call it expansion of the energy system. So that's what I see in the scientific community. When you compare that to the energy transition as it's discussed popularly, it seems that certain things are there. You start having different opinions. Some people say the problem is emissions. Other people have more fundamental problems with the energy system tied to the political systems that they support. So it starts to get into things not directly related to the consumption of energy, more like the social structures around it. So I think that the energy transition, as I said, in the scientific world, I think it's pretty clear what the definition is. In the general media, I think it depends from outlet to outlet what they mean.
I think that's exactly on the purpose of our podcast is to really try to discuss, not only the expert scientific view as you talked about it, but then the views that kind of come from that in terms of the general community. But you have a very interesting background, already in your sort of career. To get in to kind of your current research, your current area beyond that, in terms of this geologic carbon capture, can you start out and just give us a little bit of a brief background about what carbon capture and storage is all about, maybe a layman's view of how it works, so we can kind of understand the importance and the challenges?
Sure, and a little bit of background. So the big issues that we're facing with CO2 emissions is that we're putting a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. We burn gasoline, we burn jet fuel, we burn coal. These all emit CO2 into the atmosphere. So the idea is, how about we take that CO2 from the atmosphere, or which would have been emitted to the atmosphere, let's say from a power plant. Let's take that CO2, the gas we were going to emit, and let's put it in the ground. That's what it is in a nutshell. And the idea is, by putting it deep into the ground, you keep it away from the atmosphere for a long period of time, so then it doesn't have climactic or other effects on the environment.
Kind of getting back to putting the carbon dioxide back into the ground. I mean, you explain why. I mean, that's a very important why. How do we do it? What are some of the challenges?
So before explaining the challenges, I think it would be good to discuss the general system by which this would be done. So you have three parts. One part is getting the carbon. You can think of it as basically as a carbon source. The second part is transporting the carbon to where you're going to inject it in the ground. And the third part is actually injecting in the ground and managing it. So starting with the first part, which is capturing the carbon. Basically, you have a carbon source. This could be something like an ethanol plant, or it could be a power plant, something that burns coal. This is essentially a place where carbon dioxide is concentrated. In a power plant, they emit to the atmosphere. Now, the idea is instead of emitting to the atmosphere, where it would have been emitted to the atmosphere, like the top of the stack, basically it's a giant pipe. You take it from you take that carbon dioxide, and then you somehow purify it to put into a pipeline. The pipeline is what's used for transport. So that's one point. So one is industrial capture. The other one is direct air capture. Direct air capture consists of actually pulling carbon dioxide out of the general atmosphere. It's not near any industrial source necessarily. It's just, it can be in the middle of nowhere. It filters the air, removes the carbon dioxide, and then concentrates it. So it takes little bits from the air, and so it has them all kind of packed together. You can think of that as a kind of a general overview. And so it basically sucked it out of the air. So those are the two capturing ideas that you can think of. One is you capture it from an industrial source. The other one is you capture it from the atmosphere. Once you've captured it, you've got to do something with it. And what you do in the case of geologic carbon storage is you put it into a pipeline. The pipeline is, it's what it sounds like. It's basically a giant pipe. It's like the plumbing in your home, except bigger and more sophisticated. But it's basically you put it in a pipe and you ship it to the place where you want to store it. Pipelines can be a pretty cheap way to do that, as opposed to putting it in trains or trucks or whatever other vehicle transport. So you put it in a pipeline, you transport it, and then at the site, so once it arrives where you're going to store it, what this is now is essentially you're running the oil industry in reverse. Oil industry pumps oil out of the ground. Here, we're pumping carbon into the ground. And so what happens is that carbon dioxide that was shipped through the pipeline is pressurized and injected into the ground through a well. You can think of the well as basically a long straw. It's a long straw, and you're basically blowing into it, and the CO2 goes down and goes into the deep underground. And deep underground has rock layers that don't allow fluid like CO2 to go up. So buoyancy would push CO2. So there's water underground. So what the CO2 would do is once it gets into the underground, it wants to go up because there's water. Gases go above water. Kind of, if you try blowing in water, your bubbles come up. So there are rocks in the earth that actually will block the CO2 from going up to the atmosphere. And so there it hopefully stays for a long period of time, on the order hopefully of like hundreds of years.
Well, I think that's pretty clear. One of the kind of questions here is this brand new technology emerging that we're just trying for the first time, or is there a bit of a history about doing this?
There's actually a lot of history. There's decades of history of injecting CO2 in the ground, particularly in West Texas and the Permian Basin, in CO2 enhanced oil recovery. As ironic as it sounds, one of the biggest uses of CO2 is to pump more oil out of the ground. That's what happens. So what we've been doing this for a long time. We have a lot of experience pumping CO2 in the ground, at least in West Texas.
That's called what? Enhanced oil recovery, correct?
CO2 enhanced oil recovery. CO2 is pumped into the ground where it dissolves in oil. That kind of fluffs up the oil, and so the oil can push out more and come out of the wells with higher pressure.
So other than the kind of the managing to try to get the harder to get oil to come up to the surface, what other kind of applications are kind of best suited for this carbon capture? You talked a little bit about power plants, but can you go into maybe the the other applications that are being looked at today?
So when you're talking, so when discussing carbon capture, it's important to distinguish that there is the geologic carbon storage, and then there is a slew of other ways of managing it as well. Carbon capture at its most basic is capturing CO2 and putting it into some form where it's no longer in the atmosphere. So you have things like enhanced weathering, essentially putting rocks or trying to absorb the CO2 from the rocks. You've got planting trees. There was remember the Trillion Trees initiative. So those are also forms of carbon capture. So I just wanted to clarify that there are geologic ways of doing this. There are also other ways. However, those other ways I have not so far seen to be able to deal with as much CO2 as geologic carbon storage, with the possible exception of planting trees.
I guess one of the challenges then is the volume. How can we store enough of the CO2 in whatever trap or reservoir we're looking at to make a difference in terms of climate change?
In my judgment, yes, that we can. The thing that's needed is to certify what's called pore space. So underground is basically a giant sponge. People sometimes think, oil is in pools underground. Actually, it's not. It's actually like within a rock sponge. So what happens is that when we're saying, do we have the space? We have a lot of this space in terms of like pore space. These like you can think of them as the holes in the Swiss cheese, where the ground is like a giant sponge or Swiss cheese. We have a lot of that space. The question is, can we inject safely into that? That's what the question is. The space is there, as far as what we've found.
I guess another challenge then, as you kind of mentioned, is that you need to keep it there for hundreds of years, if not 1,000 years. So keeping the trap, that it's so it doesn't leak, that there aren't faults or overpressuring or whatever it is. There's kind of a whole, just as we manage a reservoir to get fluids out of it, there has to be some sort of reservoir carbon management to keep the sequestered carbon dioxide in the trap.
Yes, I've actually done research exactly on that topic, particularly with respect to faults, and that is, I think that right now is one of the great challenges. There are, last time I checked, over 100 permit applications for geologic carbon storage waiting at the EPA, United States Environmental Protection Agency. So far, I've seen, I think, only 2 that have been approved, and those are related to the Illinois Basin Decatur project, which is a CO2 sequestration project. And this is challenging. It's challenging to certify the safety of an injection operation. That I think is one of the major challenges as well as opportunities right now. As you can see, the permit applications, there are a ton of them. People want to do this, but can we certify that? Can we assure the public that it is safe? That's where I think the question is right now.
So I guess part of this current interest in all of these permits, et cetera, is that there are tax subsidies and other things that the U.S. government and other governments are doing to try to encourage the industry and other players to look at this thing. But then again, that you have the thing that it has to be safe.
Yeah, actually, the incentives have been gradually increased, and they've been, with some modifications with the Inflation Reduction Act, there's actually a lot of incentive right now. There's a lot of incentive. There's a lot of will to do this. Companies want to do it, particularly in the U.S. The government wants it to be done. States want it to be done. A lot of people want it to be done. It actually enjoys bipartisan support in the Congress, in the United States Congress. So it's the will is there, even the money is there to a great extent. It's really knowledge. that I think is the challenge. I mean, you've got the 45Q tax credits already enacted at the federal level. Even states have their own incentives, like California has the low carbon fuel standards credits. So yeah, I think in my judgment, at this point, there's a big knowledge issue that we have. Basically, finding out how we can be sure, or at least reasonably sure.
So that would be the kind of number one research challenge, is to essentially certify or make the public a lot more comfortable about, by doing this, we're actually going to do it safely, and it accomplishes the goals of keeping the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere.
Yes.
Well, this is all kind of really fascinating with regard to the things, but one of the challenges, opportunities that we want to have is to reach out and maybe educate the general public who's not a PhD and working in geologic carbon sequestration. So what should they know about all of this? When they're maybe considering, is this, as you said before, from the very beginning, we kind of tend to not think about energy until it's not working, right? Until when you hit the light switch and nothing happens, then we worry about energy. But obviously, with the energy transition, we're trying to make a major point that it really does involve everybody. That we all have to think about energy, and we have to think about the energy transition and the impacts that it has around decarbonization. So, if you were talking to someone just in the community about the things that they should know and the questions they should ask, as new laws are being passed, or new tax credits are being kind of ordered, or new projects are being permitted, et cetera. What would you what's your advice to our podcast audience about what they should know about all this?
So there are a couple major points about carbon capture, utilization, storage, and particularly geologic carbon storage, which are important to keep in mind. One is that geologic carbon storage has potential to do things that wind and solar, and for that matter, geothermal, cannot. Geologic carbon storage has the potential to do two major things. The first thing is to delink greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel consumption. Right now, the more fossil fuels we consume, the more our CO2 emissions go up. Geologic carbon storage, unlike wind and solar, has not just geologic carbon storage, but also any kind of carbon capture, utilization, storage. Unlike using wind and solar just for electricity, they have the potential to actually reduce the CO2 emissions while continuing to burn hydrocarbons. So you can continue driving, you can continue using jet fuel as you currently are, and essentially just mitigate that from an emissions standpoint. It's in that sense, it requires less lifestyle adjustment, and that's also one of the positives of it. It's also one of the things some people find more controversial, because it does continue to support the existence of fossil fuels. But from a pragmatic standpoint, we have an energy system in the world that's tremendously fossil fuel dependent. It's not going away overnight. It makes sense to at least look at how to clean it up. And so this is an opportunity to be able to continue using the system while reducing its impact, its environmental impact. So that's number one, delinking fossil fuel consumption from greenhouse gas emissions, something wind and solar do not do in and of themselves. The second thing that geologic carbon storage does, and carbon capture, utilization, sequestration, is that it allows us to undo the past. Again, something that wind and solar do not do. Whatever we put in the atmosphere is not going out just because we've switched to wind and solar. But if we capture the carbon out of the atmosphere, we can undo the past to some extent. So it's a unique tool. It's as far as what it can do. So these are the two kind of major points as to what value it can provide. More directly, as far as jobs, as far as what we're seeing this coming decade, is that it is likely going to take off. rapidly this decade. Geologic carbon storage and more generally carbon capture, but I think especially geologic carbon storage, with all the pent-up permits at the EPA, it's the pressure is there, and then once things are approved, I think we're very likely going to see major growth in this field. There's a lot that can be done, and so and also it's going to be led by the United States, because we have frankly the best CO2 infrastructure, because we had an economic need for it from CO2 EOR. So what I'm anticipating is that the likely scenario is seeing very likely a US-led CCUS expansion, but also additional parts of the world can do it too.
And I guess there's a lot of reuse of current skill sets that can happen at, and maybe some of the ways that we've used to build our fossil fuel infrastructure, we can now just use a lot of those same skills, reservoir engineering, drilling, so a lot of the chemical evaluations you said. Maybe we already have a lot of these skills available.
We do. That's something that is actually very notable about this, which is that the oil and gas industry actually has those skills, interestingly enough, to address the CO2 emissions through geologic carbon storage. So they can shift, and in part have been shifting, from just doing oil and gas to doing geologic carbon storage. And this is one of the things that we're seeing California is often ahead of the ball in these kinds of things. We're seeing in Kern County, which is where a lot of the oil production is in California. There is a shift towards an interest in geologic carbon storage. So an oil company, like let's say California Resources Corporation, formerly Oxy, now wants to do geologic carbon storage. Same skill set, some tweaks regarding the physics, but overall you're doing a very similar job.
Well, I want to thank you for a very clear explanation of some of the benefits and challenges and what this thing is. Is there anything, just kind of as a last question, that you think that we maybe didn't discuss about this so far that you'd like to add and to get into to your interview?
I think the thing is to look at it optimistically. There are things that can be done to accelerate these trends as far as geologic carbon storage and carbon capture. I think more generally, there are I think an opportunity for state geological surveys and other government agencies to take a proactive role in de-risking pore space. As I mentioned, one of the main things right now is, can we inject into a given piece of land or a given reservoir? Basically, can we put the CO2 somewhere? I think there is a role that state geological surveys might be able to play by proactively de-risking places in order to boost their economy. So the idea is the State Geological Survey does a study, publishes a study, says, hey, this looks good, and then that can lower the barrier to entry for industry partners, and that can boost the local economy, take advantage of tax credits. I think there are opportunities for things like that. And in general, I think this is very promising. This is something that can really make a difference in the energy transition. It can smooth out transitioning to more more renewable sources of energy, like wind and solar, and it can also back up the renewables. I mean, if you need some amount of some natural gas to make up for the intermittency of renewables, then having that natural gas with geologic carbon storage can make more sense than just having it emit into the atmosphere. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think there is quite a bit of optimism, certain technical challenges, but overall optimism.
Well, we always like to finish on an optimistic note, and you've certainly done that. So, Saro, thanks very much for your time and for helping to educate us on a new and important kind of topic to the whole energy transition sort of theme.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
In the second half of this episode, we dive into the topic of monitoring and reducing methane emissions from oil and gas operations using emerging technologies and data analytics. This has become a hot topic lately, as methane has accounted for about 30% of global warming since the Industrial Revolution and is 80 times more potent at warming than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period.
And a lot of methane leaks into the atmosphere from oil and gas operations. The Environmental Protection Agency estimates that methane leaks account for about 1% of total natural gas production each year, which would account for 10% of natural gas's contribution to climate change. However, recent studies have found much higher rates of leakage from natural gas production than previously known. Thus, methane leaks can make natural gas just as bad as coal in contributing to climate change. We therefore cannot overstate the importance of methane emissions in the energy transition. I now speak to two research students, Will Daniels from the Colorado School of Mines and Rachel Day from the Energy Institute at Colorado State University, about methods for detecting methane emissions from oil and gas production and the role that data might play in reducing emissions from oil and gas operations. Here is my conversation with them. So today I'm excited to have Will Daniels and Rachel Day as our guests. Will Daniels is a PhD student in the Department of Applied Mathematics and Statistics at the Colorado School of Mines. His current research focuses on methods for methane emission detection, localization, and quantification of oil gas sites using continuous monitoring systems. He also works on methods for developing site-level measurement-informed methane inventories using multi-scale measurements. And Rachel Day is finishing up her master's graduate program in the Systems Engineering Department at Colorado State University. Her research has been centered around controlled release deployments conducted in the Upper Green River, Marcellus, and the Permian basins, analyzing the performance of continuous monitoring point sensors at active oil and gas facilities. I find that it's very interesting that you both work on measuring methane emissions from oil and gas operations using emerging technologies such as satellites, drones, and data analytics. So Will, Rachel, it's a pleasure to be joined by you today. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, of course. So maybe to start us off, could you tell us a bit about yourself, your backgrounds? How did you become maybe methane hunters? What inspired you to pursue this research topic? And maybe what makes you interested about the energy transition?
Well, I went to undergrad at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. And my mentor down there, she had done work with Dan Zimmerly at CSU, Colorado State. And when I finished undergrad, I worked for a civil engineering firm. I've kind of always had a love for the outdoors and protecting the environment. So my mentor down at Fort Lewis, kind of when I was ready to get back into academia and I was slightly bored with industry, she recommended to reach out to Dan and check out the Zimmerly group and what was going on with methane. And honestly, I had no idea that, I understood global warming, climate change, but I just really had no idea how quickly the scale of just growing knowledge around emissions and especially methane emissions were and how quickly it was growing. And so I guess that's kind of how I got into it. I just lucked upon getting a good recommendation to a good group. And yeah, I've been a lot of my work has been going to oil and gas facilities and kind of just testing the performance of these sensors and their algorithms.
Thank you, Rachel. Will, would you mind sharing a bit about you?
Yeah, I kind of have a similar story. Like I really am passionate about the environment. Like all my hobbies or a lot of my hobbies involve being outside. So the climate's always been something that I've cared a lot about. And I guess in terms of work, when I started my graduate program at Mines, I was looking for an advisor and was kind of just like scrolling through the Mines website and found Dr. Hammerling, Dorrit Hammerling, and saw that she did like environmental statistics, and so kind of reached out to her, and then that kind of just got the ball rolling. And did some various stuff on like fire modeling, and then we kind of got into the methane world at the same time. And yeah, it's, I think, an exciting space to work in. Like there's a lot of focus on it right now, like from academia and also the industry on reducing emissions. So yeah, it's a cool, lots of energy in the space. So it's cool to be working in it, I think.
Absolutely. And when we're thinking about the energy transition, how would you define it? And specifically when it has to do maybe with the role of natural gas within this transition?
It's such a heavy topic, the energy transition. There's so many different layers. And I think that's something that I've really learned through my graduate program, is just how many unknowns there are. I think a big part of the energy transition is we can't just pick one form of energy to work with. And I feel like that's maybe what's kind of gotten us tied up a little bit in the past. Is I think the transition has to move more towards how do we create an infrastructure and kind of an environment where we can use lots of different forms of energy, because we don't always have one. And I think that, a lot of the energy transition maybe is looked at as just a strict move to renewables, or just a strict move to using more batteries, or more, some form of it. But I feel like a big part of it is kind of meshing everything together.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think I look at it the same way, and kind of as we figure out how to do that, like how to mesh everything together, I think it's important to try to reduce the emissions from the sources that we're currently relying on as much as possible. So like as we transition to maybe more better sourced batteries, or like other types of energy, there's still a reliance on natural gas to heat homes in the winter and stuff like that. And so making sure that the emissions from these sources that we still rely on are as low as possible is, I think, for me also part of the transition. Yeah.
And maybe when we're thinking about both your research focus, and we're thinking about measuring and using like different methods and technologies, maybe could we think about what type of methods, what type of technologies you're using, what type of measurements you're focusing on, and maybe the outcomes, the advantages that you've seen based off of your research, and maybe how we can compare these results to other data forms, to other forms of energy that you've encountered, so that we can maybe better understand how this maps out into the larger conversations of the energy transition.
Yeah, I I feel like my research has shown a lot of interesting things. I'm focused on continuous monitoring point sensors. So they're placed on the fence line of these oil and gas facilities, and they pick up a measurement showing, a concentration reading of methane. And then some algorithms, put that together and create some sort of emission rate. And as the whole world is pushing to try to reduce emissions, we have a lot of new techniques that are coming out, a lot of technologies that all have kind of different data. And I don't know, Will, if this is what you're seeing, but I feel like it's kind of something that we're really trying to wrap our heads around right now, with like methane quantification in particular. We need to have all of this data be more transparent and more on a level where we can compare apples to apples. And that's kind of, I'm sure we'll get into talking about top down, bottom up, different measurements. But that's kind of what I feel like, just kind of getting the data more unified is something I see as big.
Totally. Yeah, I agree too. Absolutely. Yeah, I think, so the stuff I've been working on for the last couple of years is like those, just like you were saying, Rachel, like those point sensors, they measure concentration, and then you have to do some sort of algorithm or model to translate that into an emission rate. And that's kind of the stuff I've been working on is producing those models and putting them out into the public domain, so that they can be transparent. And so that's kind of the aspect I work on, because I totally agree that there's a lot of companies doing this right now, like different ways of measuring methane, and a lot of those algorithms that they're developing are proprietary, because it's the thing they're trying to sell. So I think it's beneficial to have partnerships with academia where people like us can work on these algorithms and put them out into the literature, or do like controlled release testing like you do at E-CET, because I think making sure that all the technologies are doing what they're saying they're doing is also super important.
And well, maybe what you're mentioning about maybe these predictive models and data analytics, is there any way in which you think they will help oil and gas operators and regulators reduce their environmental footprint when it comes to natural gas and the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think like basically every type of measurement technology, unless you're like literally like sticking a box on top of the thing that's leaking and capturing every single molecule of gas, like all these measurement techniques have some sort of algorithm underlying how they translate the raw sensor data into some sort of emission rate. So I think like the idea of like algorithms and model development is super important, because these measurement techniques or some sort of measurement is going to be critical, because I think it's pretty well accepted now that kind of the traditional bottom-up method of estimating emissions underestimates and doesn't capture variability between different types of sites or operational practices and stuff like that. So yeah, I guess in short, like the measurements are super important, and then all of these different ways that you measure rely on some sort of model to translate like the raw sensor observations into some sort of useful information.
And we like to kind of explain things out for our audience who might not be as well versed in all these concepts, all these topics. And Rachel, you were mentioning like top down and bottom up types of measurements. So maybe could you walk us through the difference between these different types of measurements, and maybe why they're important when we're looking at estimating methane emissions?
Yeah. So kind of for the longest time, we've used the greenhouse gas reporting program. That's, it's set requirements for reporting of emissions. There are different subparts for, different fields for emissions. But for oil and gas facilities, it's the bottom-up measurements involve like an emission factor. And so that emission factor is different for, all the types of equipment that could be on site. And so you take that and you're applying that to some sort of rate that, most oil and gas operators are getting manually by hand. And then that factor that kind of calculates out to what you're reporting for the greenhouse gas reporting program. And so like Will was mentioning, there's research showing that those values are below what we assume is accurate for emissions occurring at operating oil and gas sites. So that's kind of the bottom up. And then the top down measurements are more looking at a larger area. So you have aerial flights with planes, and you have drone activity. And so that's kind of measuring an emission rate over a larger area. And there's also new research showing that, that might be running higher than what is actually emitting in certain areas. And it's also interesting because you have, if you're going to be doing an assessment, a top down, method, you're flying a plane, you're using fuel. It's not something you do continuously. So you can catch something that you wouldn't catch in 10 minutes if you were to fly past it. Or they're kind of seeing that, there are things happening when you're taking just a screenshot with some top-down techniques that you can't really get everything. So kind of continuous monitoring is kind of a newer technique, And we could talk about some of the legislation that's coming in, but it kind of, the continuous monitoring, it gives more of a continuous real time of what's going on. But maybe I took that way too far.
Yeah, that's I think about really similar problems, Rachel. And like you mentioned, I think this is like a super key point to the whole thing, is like having these multi-scale measurement platforms is really useful as these technologies are developing. Like you said, like if you have a plane fly over and capture some really huge emission, just using that one number to represent like an annualized emission rate for that site, for example, is going to be an overestimate. And scaling that down to like an accurate annualized number, you need information on like how often does that type of emission occur, or how long does it typically last, or something like that. And that's where I think you can have some benefit from these high frequency monitors, like continuous fence line monitors. And they can kind of work well together, because even if you don't fully trust the quantification results from these continuous monitors yet, you can still use them in more of like a like smoke alarm type capacity, where you just use them to tell you if there's something going on or not, and you can use that information to then piece together how often do these type of emissions occur, how long do they typically last, and then use that information together with your data from the airplane to create a more accurate number. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that I think all these things kind of work well together, and there's not like a silver bullet right now in terms of the technology.
And when we're thinking maybe of this phrase of measure what matters, and thinking about greenhouse gas emissions by industrial operations, how do you think that we can communicate this uncertainty and the different variables of within measurement to stakeholders, to policymakers, to industry representatives? And Rachel, you were mentioning about newer legislation. So how does all this come into play when we want to think about measuring what actually matters?
Yeah, I think it's kind of tying off of, what I was saying with aerial measurements, where, we have to make sure that we are aware of everything that's going on, and what's going on is being measured accurately. Because I think that, I've been working with a lot of operators, and and so CSU has METEC, it's like our methane test site, and so we've done testing there of continuous monitoring point sensors, and then my research was going out with a handful of the same solution companies and trying them at an oil and gas site. And the difference that we saw in the data was substantial, kind of forcing a lot of questions. And I think, working with oil and gas operators, standing on site with them, we have these dashboards from these point sensor companies that are showing readings, and the operators are very discouraged, and they're not sold on a lot of these technologies. And I think that's that's a gap that can easily be set and can continue to span if we don't do something in terms of everyone needs to be on the same page. Like, there needs to be absolutely no like pointing fingers, or you have to think this certain way to follow, these standards. And I think it just has to be more of like, kind of with the energy transition, of just multiple layers have to come together. And it has to be, because with new regulations coming out, we have oil and gas companies that are going to start getting fined next year for, it's a certain amount for, 1 ton over, a regulation that they're meeting. And I don't know if the solutions, if the technologies that we have for measurements are up to par for that accuracy. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how things play out, what technologies are preferred because they maybe run lower estimates. But yeah, I think just like moving forward with this, everyone has to kind of really understand the scope and the main goal, and not, because it's there are a lot of players here, and there's a lot of money rolling around, and there's a lot of big changes that are happening very quickly. And yeah, I think it's important to take the little steps moving through in communication with all of the parties involved.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, Rachel. I think that's a good perspective on it. I think, yeah, I'll reiterate, I guess, the importance of like controlled release testing and like single blind testing to understand the performance of these technologies. And you also raised a good point of the difference in performance between these controlled released sites and actual field performance, where maybe the number of point sensors you're using, for example, is like half of what you use during the controlled release trial. Those are important differences. And maybe like in real life, there's trees or hills or something like actual sites are very complex. And so thinking about that difference is important too. And yeah, I guess I have similar thoughts on just that, it's important not to just go with, or it's important to look at all the options and realize that all of these technologies are still developing pretty rapidly. A lot of them are still very new and are like pushing these algorithms really quickly that they're developing. And so just being mindful of, the limitations and the strengths of everything going forward. And I think probably in these early stages of like the Inflation Reduction Act methane fees being implemented, using lots of different types of measurements and then working kind of iteratively to see, what worked and what didn't work. It's not like next year, it's not going to be like the final thing that we're using forever, so yeah, I guess just, not to be discouraged if things are more tricky than we think next year.
And maybe this is a tricky question in itself, but how do you think that scientists and analysts can help explain these very complex science kind of work in terms for the average audience? And how can that be translated into something that is maybe a bit more palpable for folks that are not within working within the industry or in measuring methanes and other gases?
I think the kind of the academic world can serve as like a neutral party in terms of like translating, like what the technology providers are offering to regulators or to just normal people, since there's like the technology providers are companies, so they're trying to make money, obviously, and so I think the academics can play like a third party type role in terms of like testing and publishing like results and being transparent about methods and stuff like that. So I think that's certainly a role that academia can play.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. I think it's just, like full transparency, just providing, this is the data, this is what we're seeing, these are some ideas of how we can possibly make changes. But I think it is really hard to just communicate. It's interesting. So Jim came and spoke to, I'm in a transitions and energy systems class, and he came and spoke, and one thing we're talking about in that class all the time is just consumerism, and like how what we're using kind of plays out. And I feel like in the US, growing up as a kid, you don't really like think about that stuff. And I feel like it really is like, we think about the future and controlling global warming in some sort of aspect for our next generation, right? Like we want this around for our children, because if we weren't doing it, then why would we, and it's how do we continue that on to our younger generations in a way that they don't see it as just you have to be on one side or you have to be on the other. Like you can be, yes, you can be for oil and gas, and you can also be, someone who wants to help protect the environment. And I feel like just having, like open conversations, talking about what we're using, talking about like what even is natural gas? Why are we doing this? What is, and it's like we have to have energy. So yeah, I think it's just being transparent and just having, I think anytime is just having more communication and just respecting people and just explaining we're all just trying to make this environment the best that we can for the next generations.
And we like this idea about of thinking about the future. And is there anything in your work that has maybe provided you with some sense of idea or opportunities of how to use data better to maybe optimize operations, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the footprint, or maybe even for best practices that you've seen in your line of work, or maybe parallel research that you could see being implemented within your work?
Well, I guess the first thing that jumps to my mind is like because I do so much work with the continuous monitors is using them in kind of like an alert setting where instead of trying to use them to accurately quantify emissions like over the course of a year, for example, you can use them to just tell you when you think something's going, or tell the operator when you think something's happening on the site so that you can go fix it right away. And this is something I think that is still developing, like in terms of the algorithms or the technology that's used to like minimize kind of like the false alarms. So minimizing times in which an alert is sent when there's actually no actionable emission going on. And so I think this is something where the algorithms can really improve to fine tune this problem such that these things can operate and say like, hey, we think there's an emission happening right now, you should go fix this with this level of priority, essentially. So yeah, I think that's one way the algorithms can kind of be refined going forward, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot. Yeah, I think there's a lot that can be improved. I think there's a lot that can be learned. I feel like we're still like the Zimmer group is always kind of trying to come up with good ideas, and a lot of these come from like our advisory board. They have good ideas of like, hey, let's look at how methane is pooling around buildings, or let's look at how does it change, how are these sensors going to pick it up if there is a hill or if there is some sort of other obstruction. And I feel like there's a lot that can be discovered still. I think Will like nailed it. And I really do think that like continuous monitoring mixed with some sort of other technology could do like a lot of wonders in the future. But I think it has to be fine-tuned in a realistic environment where there's background emission at these sites all over the place, because I feel like there's been a good amount of testing, but I feel like there hasn't been as much testing on an operating oil and gas site with the number of sensors that an operator is willing to purchase and put on their site. So I think but it's when you have, and I mean, it's at some point, hopefully, right, methane isn't our problem as much. Like hopefully we kind of get to this place where we have our unknown emissions under control. And it is cool to hear from oil and gas companies, the big ones, who are trying to push towards just differently, sites that are constructed differently, so they don't have as many of the fugitive leaks, so the leaks that are kind of unknown. So you have a lot of leaks from thief hedges. You have companies who are getting rid of tanks. They're coming up with these new systems, possibly reducing their emissions by over 50%, almost 70%. But you still have a lot of small companies that have big emissions coming out of them. So I feel like the techniques are only going to get better, and it's just like, can we do it quick enough?
Right.
And I very much appreciate this optimistic note, Rachel, and it serves as a beautiful segue to one of our final questions for our segment today. And maybe asking you both, what inspires you or motivates you about the future of energy?
I can go first. There have been a lot of like methane conferences this fall, and I was really inspired just by meeting a lot of people working in the space that are all super passionate, and meeting them in person for the first time, and a lot of times, or in a lot of cases, and just seeing how many smart people are working on this problem is inspiring to me. I think like the oil and gas companies are working on it, the academics are working on it, and there's all these private companies building different sensors to measure this and that. And I'm kind of optimistic that it will all come together, hopefully in a way that where we can really make a difference. So yeah, that's something that was inspiring to me.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's so great to see so many people who care and who are working together. And I feel like there really is a change happening, especially like I feel this class that I've mentioned already. We had to write a midterm on energy justice. And I feel like, at the CH4 Connections conference, there was a whole panel about energy justice. And I feel like moving forward in the energy transition, we're finally asking ourselves, are we doing it right this time? Like, are we addressing everyone? Like, are we making sure we're not just, like shoving the unfortunate under the rug like we've done for so long? That's really inspiring to me, is that there are people who, number one, they want to protect the planet, but number two, they really care about everyone and how it's going to affect everyone. And it's just great. I feel like that's a newer way of thinking, where people are like, okay, let's go slow to go fast. Let's like get it right, build a strong foundation, measure twice, cut once. That's how it goes, right? Cut twice, measure once. But yeah, that's just really inspiring. It's just to see so many, very like smart minds in on something and factoring in, many levels that we hadn't maybe thought of before.
Absolutely. And I very much appreciate kind of these thoughts of looking into the future and what is inspiring you and maybe future generations. And I want to take a few moments to thank you both for sharing your insights and your expertise with us today. You've given us a lot to think about when it comes to measuring methane emissions from oil and gas operations, and also what its implications are for the future of the energy transition. And I would also like to ask you both, is there anything else that you feel is important that you share with our listeners, with our audience, any takeaways that you would like to leave them with today?
I don't think I have anything particular, except for any young girls out there. We need more women in STEM, so it's not as hard as you think it is.
Yeah, that's a great message. I'll second that. And I think, I guess this is something I've kind of already said, but just that this is, I think, a hard problem, and thinking through like the strengths and weaknesses of all the different approaches. And I think, over the next couple of years, it will be important to kind of integrate things according to their, strengths and weaknesses. Like there's not one solution at this point, I think.
So we'll leave it at to be determined, and we'll have to come back in 10 years and see what the field looks like and maybe where we're all at. But for the time being, I want to thank you both for joining us today on the Energy Transition Talk.
Thank you.
Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode exploring ways to manage our carbon emissions. It's amazing that we're developing ways to develop greenhouse gas emissions and store them underground for decades, perhaps even centuries. However, there are still large-scale technical and economic challenges, and carbon capture is not a silver bullet. We still need to focus on reducing the carbon emissions that we put into the air in the first place. So being able to identify and locate leaking methane emissions is a huge, perhaps overlooked part of reducing our emissions. As Peter Drucker, the man who invented modern business management, once said, "You can't manage what you can't measure." So we are one step closer to getting to net zero from the results of research like we've heard about in these conversations.
To me, what was interesting was all the emerging technology that can detect methane leaks from satellites, airplanes, drones, and sensitive cameras on the ground. and then alert operators to fix the leaks more quickly and to stop the escape of methane emissions. If large oil and gas companies can do it, what will it take for oil and gas producers to follow these best practices?
By better understanding how production facilities work, operators can actually design new facilities and processes to design emissions out. This takes some capital up front, but it seems like a long-term solution to sustainable practices. There may be a bit of a gap between the technical and the operational capabilities between the big and small companies, but if everyone could reach the best standard, like the methane intensity goals of OGCI, we would be making significant progress towards our climate goals.
Until next time, we hope you enjoyed a little more of the story of the energy transition, because the energy transition is up to you and me.
We would like to thank the USC Oshagi Center for Energy Transition, which aims to develop innovations in energy technologies and foster the transition to a low-carbon future, for sponsoring this podcast. Special thanks also to our guests for today, and Abhi, our technical guru, for their important contributions to our podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in to Energy Transition Talk. Please leave a rating and review, and let us know what you found most interesting from today's episode. And make sure to subscribe so you can automatically get access to our new episodes. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Justine.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Paulina.
Signing off from Energy Transition Talk. Stay tuned for the next episode.